So let me get that situated real quick. That way, if anyone wants to go back and look at the video, they can see this. Okay, so the RR and the 4 R's, the seller's response to the buyer's reply of requests. Using these to facilitate the negotiation aspect of our role as agents is knowing what form to use, and then ultimately what the form does once we come to some type of agreement. So part of the request also responds to the seller if the seller is going to do any type of request or credit or price reduction, that the buyer also responsible for the avenue to release that as a condition if the seller does agree to any of the terms of the buyer's request. Okay, so how does the RR form works when it comes to the buyer's request? Hold on one second here. Let me take that off for you, Chris. Buyer's request using the RR form. List of repairs too long. Now, the awesome part of what we have here is very simple, okay? That the RR form is a one-pager, okay? Now, it has a lot of information, and I'm going to provide you with a sample of the requests or repairs so that way you understand the dynamics of this form. Now, remember, the end goal is to allow the process to continue. We don't want to stop here as a wall and the deal falls apart, and 90 to 95% of the time, that's usually what happens. The buyer and the seller cannot come to an agreement, and ultimately the buyer decides to back out, or the seller says no to those requests and says, look, if the buyer doesn't want the property as is condition, then the seller also can submit the cancellation if the buyer does not perform in releasing this. Now, there's dynamics to each time frame when it comes to these forms, and I want to make sure that we're all clear that a seller cannot just unilaterally cancel if the buyer submits a request. It has to be what we call ping pong, back and forth, back and forth. Once the seller and the buyer come to some type of agreement, either they agree to some of the terms or they do not agree to certain terms, then that's when we ultimately go in the direction of cancellation. So I want to make sure that you understand your role and your position. For the sake of today's class, I want to make sure that we are all on the same page. We're going to be talking as if we represent the buyer, okay? So everyone on this call will be representing a buyer, and your goal and your job is to submit a request of repairs. Now, part of the request of repairs also includes termite. Now, if you've been in this industry long enough, you would have remembered that back then, 10, 15 years ago, you used to have that as part of the purchase agreement. Section 1, Section 2 of the termite was incorporated into the RPA. That has been completely removed. Now it's under the RR form, the request of repairs. So I want to make sure that you understand that when you are submitting any type of request, that it includes, in the request of repairs form. Now, the buyer can do as many inspections as they like, okay? That means a home inspection, termite inspection, sewer inspections, roof inspections, electrical inspections, foundations, anything and everything that they have regarding the property, the buyer can do inspections. They want to know the overall condition of the property before they continue moving forward or not. Now, most real estate agents and buyers typically do one inspection. That's usually the general home inspection. Now, I want to emphasize and I want to stress the fact that a general home inspection is what it is, general, okay? They're not going to do anything out of the craziness of going into a lot of the areas of the property. They'll do a visual inspection of the attic and maybe underneath the property to determine, the overall integrity of the foundation or the structure, but they're not going to go deep into it. And more so, they're not going to provide you with estimates, not when it comes to a general home inspection. Now, based on that general home inspection, we'll give you what is called a report, an evaluation of what they found regarding the physical inspection done on the property. Now it is your job and your responsibility to, sit with your clients and go over those reports and let the buyer make a determination of what they want to do. Well, if there's some major concerns regarding the property, then we can further evaluate our position by going to the specific experts. Let's just say, for example, that there is issues maybe with the sewer, right? They run the water and the water goes slow down the sink, or maybe the toilet is not flushing fast enough. That could be an indication that there may be something wrong with the issue. Not always, but that's a good indication. Something is clogging either in between the houses or the main sewer line. The buyer, within their time frame, can get additional inspections. Now, typically, when you deal with a property built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s and 80s, you may want to get a sewer inspection. Why? Well, depending on how many people have lived in that property, how many people, family members are utilizing, the sewer line on a regular basis will determine the infrastructure or the integrity of it, and maybe you have some issues with it. That's the reason you want to get an evaluation of the sewer as a perspective, okay? Now, the sewer inspection can be a plumber that has a scope video camera that can go down the main sewer line and determine if there's any issues with the sewer. Now, I stress the fact, the importance of that, especially if it's an older home that may have some concerns with the sewer line. Now, your typical cost for a sewer inspection can vary from $150 to maybe $250, depending on who you utilize for that purpose, okay? Why do you want to get an inspection done? Well, it never fails. The buyer ends up closing the deal, and then before you know it, the sewer line breaks, okay? Now that's going to be an $8,000 to $12,000 cost that the buyer is going to be ringing your cell and calling you and saying, hey, Simon, we just closed about a week ago, and now the sewer busted, and now we have a bill from an estimate that it's going to be this amount. The seller should have known about this, and they didn't provide that as part of the disclosure. Never fails when it happens to the new buyer. So this is why we stress the fact to do as many inspections, so that way the buyer is satisfied with the overall condition of the property, because you just never know. Now, that's just one example, folks, okay? It doesn't mean that's going to happen, but I've seen that firsthand. One of our agents, it happened. The deal closed, and within days, the sewer line busted. And now we were looking at an $85,000, $9,000 cost, because now they got to rip the ground, replace the sewer pipe, and then close it, and the labor and obviously the material just to do that is very, very expensive. Okay, so again, as a buyer agent, you want to make sure that you're prepared and make sure that you're researching your position and providing the buyer with all the inspections that they could possibly do. Now, there's also a form, and that form is called the BIE form. B as in boy, I as in Ida, E as in Edward. That's the buyer election form. What that form provides the buyer a list of different inspections that they can be done. I'm going to show you an example of the form, so that way you kind of understand what it looks like. So bear with me one moment until I get this zip forms up. Hopefully I can pop it up on the system. It's not coming up on here. So let me later this, stop this real quick and share my computer. There we go. Synchronize. Okay. Give it a few seconds while it's uploading this information. Then you go into your zip forms, type in BIE, and there it is. This is the form that I strictly stress the fact that you should be providing the buyer. What this form is the buyer inspection election form, okay? It goes through the importance of having property inspections. What is the buyer's duties and responsibilities? And then obviously is a disclaimer that protects us as real estate professionals. But what this form also elects for a buyer, it says under section D as in David, buyer inspection election, buyer represents and agrees that the buyer has independently considered the available inspections at the time and has decided to order only those inspections checked below. Buyer may elect to change these elections during the buyer's inspection period. If buyer does not investigate any of these items during the contractual investigation period, buyer may lose the right to investigate these items later, okay? Now, everyone should know the answer to my next question. When releasing physical inspection, how many days does the buyer have as a default amount? Okay, the answer is 17 days. Now, the buyer may elect to reduce that in order to make their offer look more appealing, right? But the contract is the contract, and the contract defines that 17 days, the buyer must release this as a condition. Now, what's so cool about this form is that it provides you with general inspections, termite inspection, chimney, electrical, heater, air condition, lead-based paint, plumbing, even do an inspection of the overall square footage of the property, easements, foundations, lot size, boundaries, pools, roofs, sewers, septic tanks, surveys, tree, wells, and the list goes on and on and on, or they can specify any additional inspections that the buyer wants. Now, the reason you want to provide this form to the buyer is you don't want the buyer to come back and say, well, Simon, you didn't tell me that I can do additional inspections. You only told me that I can only have a choice to do a general inspections. If I would have known that I had a series of other inspections that I can do with the property, I would have asked for more. Now it puts us in a position is, are you really protecting your client's best interest? So this is a form that'll protect you from any potential liability in the future, because if they come back and say something, well, we can pop this form and says, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, please be advised, here's the form that allowed you to do additional inspections. And you chose not to do any additional inspections. Now you're in a position of protection because, again, you've disclosed this form, you provided with the form to allow any additional inspections, and the buyer has the right to do any and all of these different inspections and decide what they want to do and move forward. Okay, so this is one form. Any questions regarding this form? Yes, sir.
When is this, you present this to your buyer during the buyer consultation?
Correct. Yeah, you can provide this as part of the buyer. One of the questions that came in here is, when is this form provided? Well, you can provide this form during the buyer consultation as an educational consulting period that, you know, if it's a new first-time home buyer or someone that hasn't bought and sold property on a regular basis may not be aware of these additional inspections, that the buyer has the right to do so. They can do a thorough inspection of all the property, roof, foundations, floor, walls, electrical, anything. And this form provides you with those explanations to really give the buyer the understanding that it's not just one inspection, but various inspections done. Okay. Now, with that, there's also another form that I like to share with you, and that's I think it's BW. Let me see if it pops up. Yep, it is. The BIW, which is better known as the buyer inspection waiver. Okay, And the reason I'm bringing this to your attention is because I want you to understand that, we're so sometimes very complacent, especially if you do a lot of deals. You don't realize that there's other additional forms that we don't use on a regular basis. And this will bring up like, gosh, I would have utilized this form if I would have known about it. So I want to make sure that I protect you in the overall integrity of the process of the deal, because a lot of agents unfortunately don't realize that there is forms here that protect us. Because what if the buyer decides that they don't want to do any and all inspections? Can we force a buyer to do any inspections on the property? Okay, no, the answer is no, we can't. Okay, we can advise, but we don't have to. We have a question here real quick. How do we advise buyer of which are most important? That is not our job. It's not our job to say which one is more important. Our job is just to provide this layer of different inspections that the buyer can do regarding their role and their position and doing their due diligence. But it's not our job. We're not experts in which one we should do. Now, with that being said, I want to stress the fact also that, part of our job and our role is to navigate, guide our agents, our buyers in the entire process. If it's a direct question, right? If the buyer says, well, Simon, which inspection is the most important that I should be doing? Now, that's a direct question. Then I would stress the fact is that every inspection is very important, okay? But the most important inspections are, then you can go with the items. If the property doesn't have a chimney, you're not going to ask for a chimney inspection. If the property doesn't have a pool, guys, we're not going to ask for a pool inspection. Use common sense, right? General inspections are usually the number one. That general will overlay and pretty much give the consumer, the buyer, most of the issues regarding the property. Now, as I mentioned, that general inspection is considered general. If the buyer wants to go in deeper because there's some red flags on the general inspection, then that's when you want to go to those specific experts: plumbing, electrical, roof. If the general inspection says, based on my evaluation, it looks like the roof may have some concerns because we see some spots, or maybe the roof is just in a bad condition. That's a good indicator for me that maybe we should get an estimate to see and have a professional roofing company go out there and evaluate to see if it needs to be replaced or repaired. Now we can provide the seller and the listing agent with concrete proof of the overall integrity and the condition of the roof. Then I would say go into that direction. But if it's a general direct question, then general inspections and sewer inspections are probably one of the two, and termite inspections are the most common inspections that I see happening on a regular basis with the transaction. Okay, very good question. Thank you. Is there a list of resources with prices to give buyer research? Very good question. So there is companies out there, and I think the California Association of Realtors does provide you with a site that is called Purge, P-O-R-C-H. And through the California Association of Realtors, they can actually do a report and tell you estimates of what it would cost to replace a roof based on the square footage, estimates to do electrical based on the square footage and year the home was built. So it's not as a very thorough, but an estimator that will give the buyer some indication of what the cost would be. Now, the best approach that I've always felt is the right direction is to go to that specialty company. If it's a plumber, go with the plumber that's going to possibly do the work. If it's a sewer issue, like I said, you go to the plumbers that do sewer inspections and replacements. They'll tell you, they'll give you an estimate of the cost for the replacement and the labor. Now you have the proof that you can give the seller and the listing agent. Here's the proof of the overall condition of the sewer. It looks like it's at the last stages. It's an 80-year-old sewer line that already has integrity issues. Maybe there's roots that are growing and it's not giving a good flow of it. As an example, if it's an electrical issue, maybe the electrical box may be old and needs to be replaced. Well, who do you go to? You go to an electrician that does that type of work. They can tell you what the cost of labor and the material to replace that. And now you can use that as an avenue of request of repairs. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you know, here's the invoice of a electrician that went and evaluated the box, and based on that, it's going to cost you about $6,000. You can use that as an arsenal of negotiations, okay? So, and that goes with the roof, that goes with termite. Usually you'll get a termite inspection, right? In that termite inspection, they'll go out there, evaluate the property and determine if there's infestation of termite. Once they determine, yeah, the house needs to be fumigated, tented, here's the cost to do so. It can be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000, depending on the size and the severity of the infestation. Or if they have to replace any wood. Again, that's your proof. This is what you're going to provide as part of the request of repairs, because now you have something to back up your claim. And what I mean by back up your claim is the buyer's request on why they'll want the seller to, one, understand that there is some concerns regarding the property that maybe the seller was not aware of. But two is to see if the buyer, see if the seller is willing to give some type of credit or maybe do the repair itself. Okay, so that's the whole avenue and how we do this. Now, the buyer inspection waiver is for individual buyers. Usually investors or developers will buy the property in as is condition and will not want to do any requests. And so to protect yourself from that down the line, then you want to have your buyer sign off on this buyer inspection waiver, better known as the BIW form. You're going to put the physical address, and it has the importance of investigations. It has, again, the buyer's rights and duties, but it also has where the buyer has the right to waive any and all inspections. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot force. Am I talking too loud? I feel like I'm talking a little too loud.
It's loud in here.
Okay. Just because my ears are, so if I sound too loud, just let me know, lower your tone. Sorry, guys. But the whole purpose of this home inspection waiver, it says, and it stresses, you know, the importance of having an inspection, but also it says that the broker's recommendation that the buyer obtain a home inspection, even if the seller or broker has provided a buyer with copies of a previous inspection that the seller previously received from a previous buyer that was in escrow and they ended up canceling. So we want to stress the fact and the importance of doing the buyer's due diligence, but also in the bigger picture, making sure that you are protected from the buyer coming back and said, well, Simon, you know, I didn't realize that I had the right to do inspections, even though the seller provided me with a previous inspection from a previous buyer. Doesn't mean that you don't have to do your own due diligence. So I want to make sure that we're crystal clear that regardless of any inspections that you receive from the seller, you still have the right to do your own inspections and get your own people to evaluate the condition of the property. Any questions? Okay. Okay. Yes, Chris.
It's not a question, it's a comment. You mentioned having the inspection done anyway, even if there was one recently done. It's a good idea because we did that and the new inspector found things that the old one missed.
Right.
So always have one done, even.
Yeah, 100%. Chris was telling me that the importance, even though the seller may have provided you with a previous inspection, I think it's still a great idea to get your own inspection, because 2 inspectors, just like an appraiser, I can send 2 to 3 appraisals to evaluate the home. Guess what? The appraisals, all of them are going to have different opinions of value. They're not going to provide you with the same. It's not like if the property is evaluated at 800 and I get another appraisal, he's not going to evaluate it at 800. They're going to be off either higher or lower. Well, that's the same with inspections, guys. Okay. So even though you may want to research and evaluate the reports that the seller provided you from a previous buyer, doesn't mean you have to take their word for it. Great that you have it. At least you can use that as an avenue to negotiate. But I still want you to, do your due diligence and protect your client and have them do their own inspections. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, if the buyer decides not to do it, then you want to have them sign this form, which it says you are acting against the advice of the broker, in which you really are. Let me see. I think we have a question coming in right now. So when you sent the BIE to the buyer, once signed by the buyer, do you send this to the listing agent seller just for us to keep for our records? You sound perfectly okay, clear and concise. Thank you, Christine. So this is really for your record only. You as representing the buyer. So the buyer election form, it's for you and your buyer for the purpose of having that in the in your personal file. This doesn't get distributed to the seller nor the listing agent. This is again for your protection in the future. If the buyer comes back and says, hey, you know what, this busted, this is not working. If I would have known, I would have done an inspection. Well, this form protects you from the buyer coming back and saying, well, Simon, you didn't tell me I can do a roof inspection or a pool inspection. Well, I stand corrected. Yes, we did have a conversation, and here's the form that you will sign, and you checked off that you did not want to do any additional inspections. You were fine with the general. Again, you just never know. Right now, with everything going on, you want to make sure that you protect yourself. But to answer your question, yes, it's only for you and your buyers, not to be distributed to the seller or to the listing agent. Yes, sir.
Something else too. I recently got a repair request from a buyer agent with no estimates. They wanted 15 grand. So just make sure if you're sending an RR to have estimates for whatever it is you're asking for.
Yep, I love it. So if you didn't hear, my agent Chris indicated when representing a seller and they end up just slapping a request of repairs with a number, but they don't have anything to back up that $15,000 as an example, you as a listing agent can go back and say, well, can you give me a breakdown of what this would cost? I don't need just a number, because the seller will come back and probably say no to it. Remember, there's 3 things that the seller can do. The seller can accept whatever the request of the buyer. The seller can counter that and say, look, I'll do this, this, and this, but I will not do that. The seller can credit in lieu of the repairs, and the seller can also do a price reduction if it's substantial issues with the property. And there's times that it may happen. I had a situation with one of our agents on a duplex. The back house was in bad condition. There was foundation issues. They had a engineer go out there, go under the property, and you could see that the house was leaning down. You walk into the property, he says, and you can tell that the house was already bent. So that's a great indication that there is some integrity issues with the foundation of the property. So, instead of doing the repairs, the seller says, look, it's going to be about a $20,000 cost to do it. We'll just give you the price reduction. So they had it listed for $800,000. They reduced it $20,000 to satisfy the buyer, and the buyer will be responsible to handle that once the deal closes. So that's another thing that can happen, is that the seller can reduce the price to appease the buyer's request. So price reduction, credit, or the seller can do the repairs. Or the seller also can cancel and say, look, I am not going to do anything. The property is being sold in as is condition. I don't have to respond. And the buyer has to understand that, because the seller doesn't have to respond to any of the buyer's requests, folks. And the seller can be completely silent for 17 days, okay? And send out the notice to perform on the 17th day, or 2 days prior to the 17th, send out the notice to perform. And then on the 17th day, if the buyer does not release that as a condition, then the seller has the right to cancel. Okay, so I want you to understand that that a seller does not have to respond to the buyer's request. Now, I urge you to really think about that for a moment. Okay, and what I mean by that is it's a give and take. And this is where I want you to take the emotional aspect of your role as a professional, as a listing agent or as a buyer's agent. I want you to understand the importance of your role, because this is where a lot of deals fall apart, is lack of communication, or either the buyer or the seller being stubborn and not wanting to bend. Remember, as I said earlier, it's a give and take, right? You want to give a little bit in order for the flow of the process to continue. But I cannot promise you that the seller will say yes to it. You can submit the request. And I've seen it firsthand, where the listing agent on the multiple listing service says property is being sold in its as-is condition. Therefore, don't even bother to ask for any repairs. And I've seen that right in the MLS, and they enforce that on their counteroffers. Buyer, agent, we're putting it in writing. Property is being sold in its as-is condition. Don't even ask for a request. All right. Well, again, you don't have to do that. All right. You don't have to add that verbiage into the counteroffers. The contract already says it. So in my personal, and this is just my belief, okay, take it for what it is, I would never put that on the counteroffer. Okay, I would never put that on the MLS. Why? Because the RPA already has that on as is condition. Let me show you real quick where that information is, so that way you get an understanding that I am not lying to you regarding that verbiage. All right, so this is the purchase agreement. Let me just go to the section. Stop. Oop, I went a little too quick here. Stop. Sorry, guys. Okay. Oh, it went all the way down. All right, let me go where the section that says the property's sold in its as-is condition. It's condition number 11 of the purchase agreement. Okay, right here, guys. It says the following: unless otherwise agreed in writing, number one, the property is sold as is in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance, and B, subject to buyer's investigation rights. The property, including pools, spas, landscaping, and grounds, to be maintained in substantially the same condition. Well, it goes into a different parameters, but seller shall within the time specified disclose any material facts and defects regarding the property. But here it is, folks, under section 11 of the RPA that says as is present condition. So for me, that's where I relay the information to the consumer or the buyer or the buyer's agent. I'm not going to put it on the MLS. I'm not going to put it on the counter offer. I'm just going to reflect back. Well, you know, Mr. Buyer and Mr. Mrs. Agent, the RPA already stresses that it's on the purchase agreement. It's on the condition of section 11, condition of property. All properties are sold in its as condition. Okay, very simple. So if someone wants to challenge me, okay, go for it. I'm going to go and reference this on the black and white of the contract. Well, agent, whoever that is you're aware that it shows that the property is being sold in its as condition. Look at paragraph 11, and it says it right there in black and white. That's simple, folks. Okay. Any questions regarding as-is conditions? Yes, sir.
What happens if escrow closes? I think it said something in there about the seller has to move everything out. A lot of times we're getting sellers that are leaving their stuff. How long is the current buyer, the new owner, supposed to hang on to it to give the seller time to come back and get it?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Chris, for sharing. So the question, Chris, was indicating what happens if there's debris. And it says right here under paragraph 11 on number 3, all debris and personal property not included in the sale shall be what? Removed by close of escrow. Now, this is where your due diligence comes into play, folks, okay? The contract is the contract and it defines your position. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm not saying anything out of my rear to say otherwise. I'm only saying what the contract says, and it's in black and white. It says right there that all debris that are, and also that are not, that are personal, that prior to close of escrow shall be removed. So let me take you to that section where it clarifies that for you, which is the verification of final walkthrough. I believe that's paragraph, geez. Where is the VP section at?
Oh.
All right, so section 15, you guys see it right here? Section 15 says the following: final verification of condition. So to answer the question regarding what if there's debris on the property, or what if there's personal items still left in the property, how do we combat that? How do we argue that to make sure that the seller does not leave crap on the property at time of close of escrow? Well, this is the section 15 of the RPA says the following: final verification of condition. Buyer shall have the right to make a final verification of the property within 5 days prior to close of escrow, not as a condition or contingency of the sale, but solely to confirm, 1, the property is maintained in pursuant to the paragraph 11, repairs have been completed as agreed in, and 2, seller has completed with seller's other obligations under the agreement of the form. Okay, so right there in itself, under the agreement, it already stipulates that the buyer will utilize the VP form as an avenue to put the brakes. If you know that you're going to do a final walkthrough, which is already defaulted at 5 days prior to close, your buyer is going to go and look at the property and realize, holy crap, there's still a lot of junk here and debris and personal items that have not been moved. You're going to put that on the verification of final walkthrough. And that'll utilize the avenue to stop, delay, or prolong the closing of escrow. Because once the deal closes, then it's game over. It's going to be hard for the buyer to now try to navigate and say, hey, you know what, the seller left all this crap in the house. And by that time, the seller has probably washed their hands and they're out already. Okay, you don't want that to happen to you. So how do you combat this is documentation. The VP, which I'm going to show you, let's see here. This is the form that you're going to use to be able to position yourself. And you're going to go to verification of walkthrough. And here it says the purpose of this inspection is to satisfy the buyer. What does that mean? It means that if the buyer is not satisfied, right, you're going to put the brakes on escrow closing. You as the buyer, and me, what I mean that is your client as the buyer has the right to put the brakes on escrow closing. Because once the deal closes, transfer of ownership, seller gets their proceeds, now it's going to be very hard. You still can fight this, but it's going to be a uphill battle. Because you can still take the buyers to the sellers to small claims and sue them for debris that was left. If you have to get a crew out there and it costs you $500, $600, or $1,000 to remove all this debris, you can send the seller an invoice and you send it through the agent. Okay, and the agent will send it over to the listing agent. The listing agent should send it over to the seller, because the agent probably knows where the seller is, and we can find ways to track where the seller is as well. But in essence, you can take the sellers to small claims for damages. They breached the contract, and the contract, again, black and white, says that the seller will leave the property clear from debris and personal items. And if the buyer can articulate that here on the verification of final walkthrough, this will help your position to stop the closing. Until we can get to this settlement, you're going to put this information, and how you do this is very simple. Whatever is still left on the property, you're going to emphasize this on the request of, on the verification of final walkthrough. We did our final walkthrough and we realized that there were still personal items left on the property. We want to make sure that these items are removed. You're going to send a copy, signed and executed, to the listing agent for seller to sign. And you're also going to send this copy to the escrow because you're letting escrow know, if we don't get this resolved, we're not going to close. This is the last link in order for you to stop and delay the process of closing. Because again, as I mentioned, once you close, it's going to be very hard to try to challenge this. Maybe too late. You may have some sellers that may be reasonable, but if you want to avoid all that, you put it on the final walkthrough. So let me just emphasize and just read what it says. The purpose of this inspection is to satisfy the buyer regarding the condition of the property. Buyer and seller understand and agree that unless otherwise agreed in prior contractual agreement between buyer and seller, a final inspection is not a contingency of the purchase and sale. The inspection or waiver is not intended in any way to alter the contractual obligation of seller regarding the condition of the property. So I want to make sure that I stress that. But the property will be delivered to buyer at possession of date. The inspection or waiver is not based upon any statement or representation of the broker, associate broker, agents, or employees. The undersigned agrees to hold the broker and associate license and brokerage employee harmless from any liability, claims, demands, damages, or costs arising out of this contractual obligation of buyer and sellers concerning the condition of the property. Well, that is a condition, right? If the property is not in the way it should be, this is where you utilize this form in order to satisfy the buyer. Buyer acknowledged that the property is in the same condition as the date of acceptance of the buyer to purchase, sell. Seller has completed any repairs, alterations, replacements, or modifications agreed by the buyer and seller with the following exceptions. That's where you're going to put, hey, you know, we looked at the property at our final walkthrough yesterday, and there's a lot of personal items. We just want to put it in document, put it in writing. So that way, if it gets close to closing, one day we're supposed to record the following day, we can find out from the listing agent, hey, you know, what's the status with all this personal items that were left in the backyard? Has that been removed? Oh yeah, that's been already taken care of. How do you get proof? Ask the listing agent for proof by getting pictures, or have the agents go out and look at the property to make sure that all this debris has been removed. If not, then you can stop or delay the process of escrow. The buyer can, not the agent, but the buyer can. And this verifies that role in that position. Okay, I think we have a question in here. When do you send to the buyer the BIE? So that's a great question. So the buyer election agreement can be part of the buyer consultation. The buyer consultation. So that form, when you're having a buyer consultation and saying, here's the process and getting pre-qualified, and we're gonna submit offers, show property, whatever the case, you can use this form as part of that, or once your offer gets accepted, that's gonna be part of the process of disclosures. Part of your responsibility, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, is, you have all these inspections that you can do. So you can provide that during the beginning stages of escrow, prior to even getting an offer accepted. On your buyer consultation, you can provide this. I just want to provide you with, part of the process is you get to do all these inspections, general plumbing, roof, chimney, and then have that as part of your file, so that when you actually are doing your inspections, you can reinforce that and say, look, you said that you wanted to do general inspections, roof inspections, electrical inspections. And then once that is given to the buyer, then the buyer has the right to do so. And now you satisfy that condition. I hope that answers your question, Christine. All right, let's go now to the quick request of repairs.
Simon, I have one more question about the VP. What do you do normally? And this is a question just so everyone hears the answer. What do you do normally when you have a rent back? Like, I'm closing escrow Wednesday. I have the seller. I represent the buyer. The seller is staying in the property for 2 to 3 weeks afterward. How do you do a VP when all of their stuff is there, basically, other than I'm going to look for the repairs or anything that we needed to have done? Because you basically closed escrow, but I think it's a good question to answer.
That's a very good question. So the question that was brought up, Chris, is what happens if you have a seller in possession that is staying in the property after close of escrow? How do we satisfy the VP? Well, the answer is very simple. You still do the VP because the deal is based on the close of escrow, not the seller in possession. So I know it's a little confusing to understand. Well, wait a minute. The seller is still going to stay in the property. I get that. But that's not what the form stipulates. That's not what the form says. The form says that at close of escrow, the buyer has the right to do their final verification of walkthrough. So you still do that even though the seller will stay in possession. Now, the SIP form is if it gives a license for 29 days to stay in the property, or if it's going to be longer than 29 days or 30 days, then you use what's called a lease agreement, seller staying longer than 29 days. I also, and I don't want to go too much off track on this, is let's just say that you are allowing the seller to stay in possession for 29 days, right? Then the form says on the seller in possession, let me go, because that's a very good question. CIP. The seller license to remain in possession, which is known as the SIP. The form allows, the responsibility and obligations for the condition of the property. Maintenance, seller shall maintain the property, including pools, spas, landscape grants, and all personal property included in the sale, substantially the same condition as the date of acceptance. So there you go, folks. Okay, so the VP, the request of repairs, and how the form stipulates is even after the seller closes the deal, we close, record, the buyer is now the owner. This form reinforces the responsibility of the seller to maintain the house in the same manner as when they were the owners of the property, if that makes sense. Okay, and if not, we as the buyer can go and sue the seller for a breach of the contract and damages to the property. So this is the form that accomplishes the responsibility after the fact. It has nothing to do with the VP. You still, within 5 days prior to close, you do the VP. The buyer can also waive that as well if they choose not to. But I recommend that you don't waive that. You still want the buyer to do their final verification. Even though the seller will stay in possession, you still want to make sure you do this 5 days prior to close. I hope that answers your question. I'm assuming that's a yes. Yes, Chris.
Going back to the other part where if the seller escrow closes and they have left a bunch of personal items sitting in the garage, the new owner, how long do they have to keep it for an amount of time? Or can they just junk it?
So the question is if this is like a seller in possession,
No,
or this
it's
is
a regular close of escrow,
okay.
and they left stuff behind when they were supposed to clean it out.
Okay, that's a very good question. So the question came in is what if the seller after close of escrow leaves personal items on the property? What is the responsibility of the new buyer, or excuse me, the new seller, or excuse me, the new buyer, my bad. What is the position of how long do we have to discard of this? So the question here is, what's the time frame? Is it a day or so that we can get someone to toss it? Well, the best case scenario that I recommend is you want to reach out to the listing agent, send out an email saying, hey, there's personal items still left in the property, and I'm giving you a certain time frame to have the seller pick up the personal items. Because there may be items that maybe they forgot, or maybe they just don't care. But you also have to give the seller the time frame, because it might have been a position where they forgot to pick it up. Who knows? So how long do you allow this personal items to stay on the property? Well, the answer is it really depends. Now, we're not going to drag this for 30 days, but you're also going to let the listing agent know, and the agent yourself will type up an email to the listing agent. Hey, just wanted to advise you that my clients, the buyers, have stated that there is personal items, and then you're going to itemize whatever was left. You're also going to take photos of everything that was there as documentation. Whatever they left, if it's furniture, if it's clothing, if it's personal items, whatever that is. I've seen where people leave vehicles. It's truth to the matter. At one point in time, that needs to be removed, and then it falls on the responsibility of the register owner. So you want to stress the fact by taking photos of all the personal items. Then you're going to follow up with an email to the listing agent that says, look, you have a week to get this taken care of. Otherwise, whatever costs incurred that I get, or meaning the buyer gets, then we're going to send an invoice, and that invoice is going to have to be paid by someone, either by the listing agent or by the seller itself. So again, if you put a parameter of time, then by that time you can go ahead and discard of the items. Now, it's not like property management, where we have to maintain this and then ultimately it gets sent out to the state or something to that nature. This is a different dynamics here. This is a transaction, a buyer and seller transaction. So, you want to do, what's best for everyone, but you want to also do it in a way that you don't just discard all this and then, the seller comes back and says, look, my intentions were not to leave it, but, we moved out of states and somehow I forgot to let my daughter, my son know that that was the last of the items, and we failed to tell the listing agent. So there's many variables that can happen. So I would say at least a week, 2 weeks, and if there's communication, then you'll know that it's going to be taken care of. But if you get no response, bring it to your broker's attention and have the broker reach out to their brokerage and see if we can get the brokers involved in this to compromise and say, hey, your listing agent was advised, and now we have not heard from the listing agent. We're bringing it up to your manager or the broker. And usually the broker will step in there and talk to the listing agent. Hey, I got a call from Simon, the broker from Keller Williams, indicating of personal items that the seller left. What's the status? that'll trigger the agent to either find out, call, and find out what the answer to is. If they say, well, you can go ahead and discard all these items, then you're going to want something in writing. Then the buyer can discard it as long as we have something in writing. And what if it's going to cost the buyer some money? Then we can go back and forth and say to the listing agent, well, this is going to cost money to have all this removed. We're going to send you an invoice, and then let it bring it to the broker's attention, so that way we can send out an invoice to the brokers, because sometimes the brokerage will eat some of the cost as well, if they're not getting any calls from the seller as well. So someone has to be responsible for items left after the close of escrow. So I hope that answers your question, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, let's continue here. So good questions, by the way. Very good questions. All right, so the request of repairs. All right, real quick, what time is it? It's already 3 o'clock. My gosh, time flies when you're having fun, guys. All right, so how does the request of repairs work? Seller can respond with a RRR form, which is the seller's response to the seller request. And the response to the request, but a response is a courtesy. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the seller does not have to respond to the buyer's request. Okay, I mean, it is a courtesy, but it's not an obligation. So the seller can be completely silent for 17 days, even though, let's say that the buyer sent out a request of repairs 10 days in escrow, and you're waiting for a response and you don't get a response. And now the 11th day, the 12th day, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, and you still have not got a response. Common sense is obviously the buyer's agent is probably going to reach out to the listing agent and ask, hey, what is the status of that request of repairs that we sent out on the 10th? And we haven't got a response back. Well, I haven't heard anything from the sellers. Let me follow up. Or you may get a response right there and then saying, the seller is not going to respond. You were aware that this property is being sold in its as-is condition. Okay. Now you're going to relay that information to the buyer, and now the buyer has to make a determination. Do they want the property, or if they want the property, we'll continue moving forward and wait until the 17th day to release that as a condition. Or the buyer says, you know what, if the seller is not going to do any of the type of repairs or credit, then I'd rather just cancel right now and walk away. And the buyer has that right to do so. Okay, so that's what the request of repairs indicates in the seller's response. Okay. Why is this frozen here? For some reason it jumped back up. I don't know what's going on here. Okay, the RRR form works as 1A, the list of those items seller will not make. So part of the seller's response, and I think the best approach is obviously to provide you with the actual repair request, so that way you get an understanding of what the form looks like. So bear with me here momentarily. And can you see this? Yeah. All right, so the request of repairs looks like this. Okay, this is what the buyer will be submitting from the buyer's agent to the listing agent regarding the request. If this is your first request, you're just going to put request number 1, the date this form was repaired, all the information such as the address, buyer's name, seller's name, and then it has certain items. Buyer request that the seller, prior to final verification of condition, which is the VP, repair or take any specified actions for each item listed below. And that's where you can put the laundry of list of things that the seller, that the buyer is requested to be done. Or you can click on this and you can attach a automized list of requests. You can add it here. Section 1B indicates if you are requesting termite. Section 1, Section 2, and the inspection company that went in and did the inspection, the termite, then you're going to put the name of the company, and then what date the inspection was done. Okay, if it was done on Saturday, you're going to stress the day that it was done on Saturday, the 13th, as an example. If the buyer is requesting part 2 or section 2, then you're going to stress that both section 1 and section 2 will be done. Section 1C gives this section here if you're requesting credit in lieu of any repairs. So the awesome part of this form, it allows that the buyer can ask for all three. The buyer can ask for repairs. The buyer can ask for credit. The buyer can ask for price reduction. It allows you to check all three, okay? There you go. So I've seen firsthand where listing agent says, well, the buyer can only ask for one or the other. They cannot ask for the seller to repair, certain items, give a credit, and then price reduction. The answer is no. The buyer can request all three. And if the seller is willing to do so, then you continue with the process. Now, typically you don't ask for all these items. Mostly it's usually section C as in Charles. Usually in lieu of the repairs, the seller will ask for, the buyer will ask for, like, let's just say $10,000, okay, as an example. Now, as Chris was saying earlier, he indicated that you got to be more specific instead of just throwing a number and hope it sticks. And I get it, because at the end of the day, how do you know how valid this is? And really, let's just say that the inspection report was only $5,000, but the buyer wants an additional $5,000. I want to validate that, and I want to be able to bring this to the seller's attention and say, look, here's a legitimate inspection done by a reputable company, licensed and bonded, and here's an invoice indicating what it would cost to get this done and replaced. Now I can argue that and say to the seller, look, it's a legitimate cost. I'm not going to take the buyer and the buyer's agent's amount as legitimate. You want to, and again, this is how you approach these negotiations, bring the evidence that you can argue your position. Just throwing a $10,000 price and hope it sticks, you're going to get a savvy listing agent that's going to say to the seller, look, there's no validity to this. I say that we don't respond to it. But if you have a legitimate issue with the property, then by all means, the seller should be able to negotiate. And maybe the seller will not give you the 10,000, but is willing to give you 5,000. Okay. Remember, it's about continuing the process. Okay. And then last but not least, the buyer can also request a price reduction. Let's say that the property is 800,000 and the buyer says, look, in lieu of the repairs, in lieu of credit, just give me a price reduction of $10,000. So the buyer can now put a $790 price point from the listing price. And if the seller does agree to a price reduction, all you have to do is do an addendum that says that the price was reduced from 800 to now 790 as agreed upon, an addendum, and that gets sent over to escrow. And then escrow will do an amendment and have both the buyer and the seller sign off on it, and that changes the numbers. And as long as the buyer and the seller agree to it, it's golden, you have it done, okay? Any questions so far? Now, the bottom where it says seller's response, the seller agrees to all buyer's requests. That means any of the three items, or seller does not agree to any of the buyer's requests, then basically says no to anything. Property is being sold in its as-is condition, that's it. Now, does that mean that the buyer and the buyer's agent stop there? No, the buyer can come back and throw another request and say, well, this is going to be request number 2. Maybe it's a little different than the original. Instead of $10,000 worth of credit, maybe they're just asking for 5,000, and that's perfectly fine. Or maybe they're 800, a 790 price point. They are willing to take the property at 595, 795, I should say. Okay, so just because the seller says no doesn't mean that the buyer cannot send out another request of repairs. Remember, it's all negotiations, folks. That's all it is. Okay, question.
C and D not together. You're just doing that as an example here. But if you were asking for price reduction, you wouldn't have a checkbox in C with a price for credit, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I would probably have it
Take
this
all
way.
that together.
I was just illustrating that as an example, but if you are asking for, if you're asking for a price reduction, then you're probably just going to check out D as in David. And no, it's not the Ghostbuster. Sorry about that. All right. So any question regarding the request of repairs? Now, real quick, and then we should cut loose for the afternoon, is the RRRR form, which is the seller's response to the buyer's request. Now, this is a fun form that I truly enjoy, is because this one defines and really puts perspective to the seller's position and authorization in order to say yay, nay, no, and the consequences. Okay, so here it is. If the seller is sending out their first seller response to the buyer's request, then you're going to put as number 1. This is now the listing agent. Okay, so now we're switching hats. You are now the listing agent on this. It goes through the same motions of, what request was sent. So let's say it was request number 1 from the buyer, the date, address, and buyer and seller's name. Seller's responds to all buyers' requests on repair number 1, except maybe the seller is willing to do certain items of the request and then certain items not willing to do. So again, you can stress and emphasize exactly what they want. The seller can say, instead of A, I will rather give a $5,000 credit. Remember, it's documentation. You want to make sure there's a flow so there's no confusion of what was agreed upon. Maybe the seller says, look, I don't want to do any of the repairs. It's just going to be the 5,000, take it or leave it. And if the buyer does accept it, then he's going to sign off on it. Then if the seller decides a price reduction as well, or instead of the 5,000, we'll reduce it to, whatever that amount they agreed to. Section 2 talks about the seller's agreement only applies if the buyer removes in writing physical inspection contingency. So the awesome part of this form is you can put the buyer in check. So by checking section 2 here, what it does, it populates the contingency removal form as part of the acceptance. So the seller will not do any of the agreed upon terms until the buyer signs off on the contingency. So the contingency will say is 1, and if the buyer still within their time frame, but in order for us to continue the process, then we can identify that the buyer is willing to release the contingency identify of this request of repairs. And if the buyer does not release that, then ultimately the seller does not have to grant any of the 3 items: credit, price reduction, or any repairs whatsoever. Okay, and section C is in Charles, release seller and broker from any loss of liability, have the seller sign off on it, and that gets sent over to the buyer's agent. The buyer now has the right to respond to the seller's response, and the buyer accepts those terms. Buyer accepts the seller's response with the following modification. So if the buyer is not 100% satisfied with the overall response back from the seller, then you can have the buyer sign off on this modifications. Okay, we agree that the seller is giving us the 5,000, but we're still wanting to have that AC maintained and service before we close the deal, and that's going to be $500. They may throw that, as part of the agreement. Again, all property sold in is as condition, meaning that they do not have to take care of that as part of it. But again, it's what we call the back and forth negotiations. Then section C, it talks that if the buyer wants to withdraw the original agreement on the request and now sends out a new request if the buyer is not completely satisfied with the overall seller's answer. Okay, then that's when this information gets signed and sent over, and the buyer would sign off on it. Now, the last part of the seller's request, seller's modification of request, seller agrees to the buyer's modification on the terms provided above, or seller rejects, does not agree to the buyer's modification. Buyer may submit a new request of repair. So if the seller says no to certain things that the buyer is requesting, then the seller will sign off on this and say, look, we will only agree to the 5,000, but we're not going to agree to do the maintenance of the AC as part of the agreement. Okay. And then the buyer has to make a determination if they want to continue with the process or if they want to cancel, because this is within their time frame to back out of the deal. Under paragraph 14B of the RPA, it says that the buyer has the right to do any inspections and submit a request. And if the buyer doesn't get their request, then the buyer has the right to cancel. Okay, so I hope that kind of answers your questions regarding this. Let me go back real quick and click this. Is seller obligated to make any repairs? The answer is no. The seller is not obligated. And that's paragraph 11, as I mentioned. Property is sold in is as is of date of acceptance. Seller must repair damages. Seller must repair damage to the property that occurs between the date of acceptance and before close of escrow. Now, with that being said, folks, if you're in escrow, right, and there is an issue that occurs during escrow, let's say that the water heater busted, right? And now there's water all over the place. The seller cannot say, well, I'm selling the property as is condition. That is after the fact. That is now new material fact. And the seller is responsible to fix that. But if it's a condition that is a pre-existing situation and the buyer is aware of it, then the seller does not have to. I'll give you an example. Let's say that the electrical box, for some odd reason, it busts and now there's no electricity. The seller cannot sell the property without, getting that repaired or replaced. The seller cannot sell the property with no electricity. So that forces the seller that they have to sell the property with a new electrical box or with the electrical box in working order. If that happened during escrow, then we, as the buyer and buyer's agent, have an avenue to argue that and have that repaired. The seller cannot come back and say, well, unfortunately, it happened during escrow, but the property is being sold in as is condition, and that was part of the condition. Then we can argue that and say, no, that is not a pre-existing situation that happened during escrow. We are buying the property with at least the electrical working or electricity working. Then we can argue that fact, and that's what the claim states here. Repairs required by the state and local law, except point of sale, bracing a water heater, retrofitting slides and shower doors install, smoke detectors. Law enables cost of repairs to be negotiated, but parties may not contract to avoid them. So absolutely, things that are state related, such as smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, those are state statutes that must be incorporated. Then the seller has to install smoke detectors and carbon monoxide. Now, here's the big picture. What if the property is a property that is going to be a tear down? Okay, meaning that it's a new construction. They're going to completely renovate or knock down the house and put a new build out. Is the seller required to provide smoke detectors? The answer is unfortunately yes. Okay, They don't have to be installed. They can be left in the property as new in the box. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, for the compliance purposes, here are the smoke detectors. Here is the carbon monoxide. And then here is the bracing that is necessary to brace it in the future. We have complied with the rules and regulations of the state or government. So the seller is still responsible. They don't have to install them, but they can be given to them as part of the condition to meet the state and local laws. Okay. And the RPA paragraph 11 states property improvements may not be built to code in compliance with current laws. So yeah, if a home was built in the 1950s, all right, and they have not done any improvements to the property, you cannot force the seller to say, well, it's 2021 or even 2022, you must bring the property up to code. The answer is no, they're not obligated to do so. During the time in the 50s, that's how it complied. You don't have to modify and force the seller to bring it up to new codes, okay, if the property, because you can base it per the build of the home. If the home was built in the 50s, codes were done differently, laws were done differently, and now in the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s, it's obviously has changed and improvements. I think we have a question here, so go ahead, Christine. Did you have a question?
I did. Sorry, I couldn't find my thing. Yeah, actually, this happened to me today, so I've never had this happen before. But sent the RR. They agreed to it and attached, with attaching the car form CR with it, right?
Uh-huh.
But when I looked at the CR form, instead of it just being physical, it removed the appraisal, which was not due now. So I'm like, what the heck? And I was like, this is a smooth one. They tried to pull one, but it was like, okay, I can't do this. So what is the problem here? So now it's been, it's a little bit of time and we're just kind of sitting there. So today, I'm waiting for the agent to call me, but what I did was I signed it, but I attached and I wrote her an email saying, this is what I'm doing to make you feel everyone feel that this is transactions moving forward, but we're not ready to release the appraisal. I attached our contingency removal. If this is the right thing to do, this is what I did, but contingency removal 1 with, everything, but we removed all contingencies except for appraisal and loan. So
Okay.
I'm waiting for that to come back to me. It was like a sense of here, I'm trying to do something so you feel comfortable and your seller feels comfortable, but I'm not putting my buyer at risk for the appraisal.
Right. Yeah, so I want to make sure I got this correct. You represent the buyer or the seller on this?
Buyer.
Okay. So yeah, if the time frame to release a certain contingency is not up, then by all means, just because they put it doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer has to release it. So let's just say that 17-day was agreed upon, or 10 days was to agreed upon on releasing the buyer's inspection, but you still have your appraisal. Doesn't mean that the buyer has to release the appraisal if it's not up yet. You only release what you agree to. The rest will stay until the date of releasing that. So if it's 17 days, then the buyer has the right to continue and release that at that time.
But if you were to read it word for word on the RRRR there with their contingency release, right? Then that means we were. So basically we had an open thing. If I didn't send my form saying, hey, we'll sign off on this, they're not agreeing to what's on the RR. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? So
Of course.
This way it moves it forward.
I get what you're saying. So yeah, the contract defines really clear that, and I would never recommend any seller to do any type of repairs until we know that the buyer is going to release any and all contingencies. So you're 100% correct. Just because the seller said he was going to do these repairs, it's based on the buyer releasing any and all contingency, not just one, not just two, but all contingencies. And as a listing agent, I would also stress the fact is Mr. and Mrs. Seller we're not going to tent the property. We're not going to fumigate the property until we know that the buyer has released all conditions. Because what happens is if the buyer still has any contingency as a hold, the buyer can back out of the deal, and there's really not much we can do for damages that the buyer can incur, or the seller cannot go after the buyer's deposit. So you got to be very, very careful. The only way that the seller can go after their the buyer's deposit is if the buyer has released all contingencies. Now it exposes the buyer's deposit, and now we can articulate our position is, we lost money, we have to pay a mortgage payment, and now we can utilize some of that deposit up to 3% for damages. I hope that kind of makes sense. I don't know if I lost you. I think my battery died. Okay, I don't know what happened to my headset. Let's see if I can push it right here. All right. Can you hear me okay still?
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I had to take off, for some reason my battery died. So I hope, Christina, I was able to answer your question. All right, let's continue. All right, so when it comes to FHA and VA loans, it's a different parameters. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, has certain rules and regulations when it comes to request repairs. If the underwriter on a government loan flags it and says this must be taken care of, then unfortunately the buyer will not be able to get the loan, and therefore it would kill the deal, even though the property is being sold in its as-is condition. This is why a lot of listing agents and sellers really gear away from accepting FHA or VAs, because there's stringent regulations that unfortunately fall into these government loans. Now, with that being said, these loans are phenomenal for first-time home buyers or veterans that are going in with no money down, no closing costs, or very small down payments. But on the flip side, if you were to get a cash offer, a conventional FHA and VA loan simultaneously, you got to weigh it out. Which one is the best benefit to you? Well, obviously cash is key because it eliminates any red tape, right? There's no conditions, there's no underwriter conditions. It's cash. And then you have a conventional with 20-30% down, which is a strong down payment that if it doesn't appraise right, the buyer may come in with some of the difference because they have such a large down payment. Whereas FHA and VA loans, if it doesn't appraise and there's a big gap, the deal may fall apart. Or if the underwriter puts stringent condition, well, there's a spot there on the ceiling, we want to further investigate, and unfortunately, if the seller says no to it, it'll kill the deal, and the buyer will not be able to obtain the loan. So, just want to stress the fact that FHA loans and VAs are very particular when it comes to conditions. Evaluating the request of repairs, again, material defects disclosed in the inspection report must be disclosed to other prospecting buyers. Other buyers may want similar repairs. Selling price may be affected if the sale is canceled and the property is relisted. If buyer isn't satisfied with repairs, seller may face post-close negotiations or liability. This is common reason for sellers to offer credit or price concession instead of making repairs. Absolutely. Remember, you go into escrow, the deal falls apart, and the seller has been provided with new reports. That is now part of the material fact and disclosure. Well, Simon, the repair request or the report was crazy. They were asking for $40,000 because the house is tilting. Well, I hate to say this, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, folks, but unfortunately, because it was provided as part of the buyer's disclosure, you now have to provide that to the new potential buyer. Now, you can stress, you can emphasize and say, look, this report was given, but they were trying to use it as an arsenal negotiation. It was an investor. and the investor wanted to get it at the lowest possible point. And that's why the report looks as bad as it is. You still want to encourage the buyer and the buyer's agent to do their due diligence and inspections because it may be different, as Chris said earlier. Just because an inspection was done doesn't mean that the new inspector is going to find the same and identify the same issues. So that's why it's very, very important that the buyer does their inspections. Alternatives to making repairs. The Form RR enables the buyer to ask for repairs credit or a price reduction or all. Seller might offer a credit or a reduction in price in lieu of making repairs. Repairs of conditions by seller may be required by buyer's lender, and that's usually FHA and VA loans. If the lender disallows the credit, the lender decision must be respected and the credit will not be paid. Solution: ask lender about any maximum credit allowance in advance. So yeah, if you are representing a buyer, I would urge and stress the fact is, what is the maximum credit allowable? And if they say the maximum allowable is $10,000 or 1 point, 2 point, or a percentage, then at least you know where your buyer stands, because most of that will go back to the seller's proceeds. So just ask those questions and be very diligent in your position. Additional resources. A lot of this information can be found through the California Association of Realtors, through the legal tools. Again, most of the stuff that I provide is right straight from the California Association of Realtors. With that being said, that pretty much concludes my class. Any questions? Have to hop off. Okay, no problem, James. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Christina. It's always a pleasure to see you on my classes. So thanks again. Really appreciate you all. And be on the lookout for our next class. All right. Have a phenomenal afternoon. Stay safe. And we'll see you on the next training class. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hope.